Ciao a tutti, benvenuti o bentornati sul mio canale. Today we keep exploring Italian object pronouns by focusing on indirect object pronouns. Let us quickly remind ourselves of what an indirect object is. When a noun or a noun phrase does not directly follow a verb but is preceded by a preposition, it is classified as an indirect object. In the sentence, the presenter speaks to the audience, the object the speaker is addressing is the audience. Because the audience is not directly following the verb, but is preceded by preposition to, it is actually an indirect object. We can make this sentence more concise by replacing the indirect object, the noun, with an indirect object pronoun, which in the case of the audience can be either it or them. So we can say the presenter speaks to it or the presenter speaks to them. Now let's move on to Italian indirect object pronouns. Indirect object pronouns are usually paired with intransitive verbs, but sometimes they can be paired with transitive verbs which behave like intransitive verbs. We'll see some of these later. Also, indirect object pronouns answer the question to or for whom and to or for what. And like direct object pronouns, they include both stressed and unstressed forms. A word of warning before we look at Italian indirect object pronouns. In the examples I'll provide throughout the lesson, you will notice that the English translation of the sentences does not always reflect the transitive or intransitive nature of Italian verbs. This is because some verbs that are transitive in English are actually intransitive in Italian and vice versa, and the same thing goes for direct and indirect pronouns. Take, for example, English verb to call somebody. This verb is transitive and it is followed by a direct object, somebody. But translate this into Italian and you get telefonare a qualcuno, where telefonare is an intransitive verb and a qualcuno is an indirect object. Another example, to listen to something or somebody, ascoltare qualcosa o qualcuno. In English, to listen is an intransitive verb and to something or to somebody is an indirect object. But in Italian, ascoltare is a transitive verb and qualcosa or qualcuno is a direct object. So if you're unsure whether to use a direct or indirect object pronoun, a good starting point is to check in a dictionary whether the verb is transitive or intransitive. Let's start looking at Italian indirect object pronouns. Unstressed forms first. Singular indirect object pronouns, unstressed forms. First person singular, mi. Second person singular, informal unstressed form, ti. Second person singular, formal unstressed form, le. Third person singular, masculine gli, feminine le. Second person singular pronoun le is used to replace both masculine and feminine nouns, and it is written with a capital L to distinguish it from third person singular feminine pronoun le. Plural indirect object pronouns, unstressed forms. First person plural, ci. Second person plural, vi. Third person plural, gli. There is another third person plural unstressed indirect object pronoun form, loro, but it is slightly more formal, and nowadays gli is the form most commonly used. Let's look at these unstressed forms once again. This time repeat after me. Singular, mi. Ti, le, gli, le. Plural, ci, vi, gli. And now we focus on how these unstressed indirect object pronoun forms work with both transitive and intransitive verbs. Let's start by taking a common transitive verb, scrivere, to write. In the sentence scrivo una lettera, scrivere behaves like an ordinary transitive verb and is followed by a direct object, una lettera. But this verb can also act as an intransitive verb. Take, for example, the sentence Susanna scrive a Veronica. In this case, scrivere is not followed by a direct object, but by an object, Veronica, preceded by preposition a. So, a Veronica is an indirect object. If we want to make the sentence more concise by using the unstressed indirect object pronoun, we say Susanna le scrive. In the first sentence, the indirect object follows the verb, but if we want to replace it with the unstressed pronoun form, then this must precede the verb. Alongside scrivere, other transitive verbs behaving like intransitive verbs include credere, to believe, and pensare, to think. Let's now look at an example of intransitive verb plus indirect object using verb assomigliare, to resemble, to look like. In the sentence il bebè assomiglia al papà is the indirect object. If we want to replace it with the unstressed indirect object pronoun form, we say il bebè gli assomiglia. Here again, rather than following the verb, the pronoun precedes the verb. Other intransitive verbs similar to assomigliare include piacere, rispondere, telefonare, interessare, bastare, obbedire or ubbidire, mentire, servire, mancare. In the examples we've just seen, the unstressed indirect object pronoun forms go before the verb. However, the placement of these pronouns can change. Let's look at the rules. Italian unstressed indirect object pronouns usually go before the verb if the verb is conjugated in the indicative, conditional or subjunctive tense. Let's look at some examples. Indicative: ti parlo. Conditional: ti parlerei. Subjunctive: e se non ti parlassi più? If the verb is a direct imperative, and by that I mean tu, noi and voi forms, unstressed indirect object pronouns go after the verb. The pronoun in this case is added at the end of the verb to form one word. Here are some examples. Parlami, parlategli, parlaci. Please be aware that in other forms of the imperative, the polite forms, rather than going after the verb, pronouns go before the verb. But I'll explain that in a separate lesson on imperatives. If the verb is followed by the infinitive or by the gerund, unstressed indirect object pronouns can go either before or after the verb. Here are some examples. Infinitive: ti voglio parlare, voglio parlarti. When the pronoun is added at the end of the infinitive, you always have to drop the final e before adding the pronoun. Gerund: ti sto parlando, sto parlandoti. Okay, let's move on to stressed indirect object pronoun forms now. Singular indirect object pronouns, stressed forms. First person singular, me. Second person singular, informal stressed form, te. Second person singular, formal stressed form, lei. Third person singular, masculine, lui, feminine, lei. When these pronouns are used in a sentence, they are always preceded by preposition a. A me, a te, a lei, a lui, a lei. Plural indirect object pronouns, stressed forms. First person plural, noi. Second person plural, voi. Third person plural, loro. Again, these pronouns are preceded by preposition a noi, a voi, a loro. Let's review one more time both unstressed and stressed forms. Repeat after me. Singular, mi, a me, ti, a te, le, a lei, gli, a lui, le, a lei. Plural, ci, a noi, vi, a voi, gli, a loro. Now let's look at a few more sentences with indirect object pronouns. Stressed indirect object pronouns are used when you want to emphasize the indirect object of a sentence or highlight a contrast. They usually go after the verb. Here's an example of how to replace an indirect object with a stressed indirect object pronoun. Parlo a Milo, non a Sara. Parlo a lui, non a lei. In some cases, stressed pronoun forms can also go before the verb. A noi piacciono le caramelle. A lei basta poco per essere felice. Vi bastano 2 uova per fare le crêpe? No, non ci bastano, ci servono 3 uova. Ti telefono stasera, Laura. Ma perché telefoni sempre a me? Lasciami in pace. Non ti mentirei mai, Biagio. Credimi, devi credermi. Come posso credere proprio a te? Ci piace chiacchierare mentre andiamo a scuola. A me piace ascoltare la musica mentre vado a scuola. Che regalo farai ad Armando? Gli comprerò quei cioccolatini che piacciono tanto a lui. Se uno studente mi fa una domanda, sono sempre felice di rispondergli. Inviti Tiziana alla tua festa? Sì, sto mandandole un messaggio giusto adesso. Signora Lia, le va di andare a ballare? Certo che mi va. Now pause the video and rewrite these sentences using the appropriate stressed or unstressed indirect object pronouns. Answers are available in the description box below. And that's all for this lesson. If you have enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. Grazie e arrivederci!